Other than the Russo-Ukraine war, the major geopolitical crisis the world is facing at the moment is the renewal of tensions between Taiwan and mainland China, otherwise known as the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China, respectively. And people draw a lot of comparisons between these two conflicts, and there is a lot of similarities. In both cases, America is facing off against their two major geopolitical rivals, obviously the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. You have a country where the legitimacy of its existence is questioned, whether or not Taiwan is a different country from mainland China, and whether or not the Ukraine is a different country from the current incarnation of Russia. Likewise, both countries, both of America's rivals at this point in time at least, have an alliance of convenience, as I'd like to say, because sometimes China is more pro West, sometimes it's more pro Russia. It's very much kind of a game of musical chairs. And this goes back to the 19th century with the Great Game, where the various great powers just kind of try to carve up Asia between them, and alliances are constantly shifting. At the moment, though, as Russia's diplomatically isolated from the West, they've sought much closer relations to China. So in both cases, like I said, they're up against a major geopolitical rival who's testing the waters, who's trying to reclaim what they see as lost territory. And the United States feels that they have a geopolitical interest in both areas, whether to use the particular country as a buffer state, if they view that they have some sort of historical responsibility to them, if it's to preserve democracy, if it's to prevent their rivals from gaining the additional power or the additional prestige. There's a lot of different reasons the US is involved in both conflicts. And it's very much up in the air whether or not it'll eventually become a shooting war between the US and Russia or China, depending on how far and how long these conflicts go on for. That being said, the question I want to address today is Taiwan a country? Is it independent from mainland China? Should it be independent? Should it be recognized? And should any kind of protections be provided to it? Because I think this issue is a lot more complex than the issue of Ukraine. And we'll go through the various reasons why I think that. But I do think there's often a tendency, and I hate to be the big brain guy, to just say we don't like the United States and its foreign policy. So anyone who's against the United States, be it Cuba or Venezuela or the Taliban or North Korea or China, is based, and we have to support them because they're automatically better because they're anti US. And I think a lot of people, in terms of the Taiwan China thing, just knee jerk support mainland China because theoretically, on the surface at least, Taiwan seems to be more socially liberal, and Taiwan is more pro America. And because they're anti America, they innately just want to back the anti American group. The idea is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which is sometimes true and sometimes not. Once again, the problem with all of this stuff is it's very complicated and nuanced. And a lot of people just want simplicity. And I recently did a video saying simplicity is sometimes good, but it's sometimes not, and it's ironically complex when things are simple and when things are complex. But that being said, let's just talk about the historical background of this. So Taiwan was a Japanese colony prior to World War II. When Japan lost World War II, all of its colonies were taken from it, including Taiwan, Korea, if you want to count Manchukuo, and a number of different Pacific islands. It was given to something I think a lot of people forget is we talk about the big three now of Stalin, Churchill, and FDR, but it was actually the big four because China was considered the fourth major nation involved in the Allies, and Chiang Kai shek was the fourth member, but that was kind of scrubbed a bit from history as mainland China is very strict in terms of historical revisionism. So after the World War II ended, Taiwan, as well as whatever Japanese territories the Western Allies captured, were given back to the Republic of China, whereas I believe the Soviet occupied areas were given to Communist China. We then had a civil war that went on for a couple more years. It had been kind of a low intensity thing prior to Japan invading. Chinese politics and who's on what side and which warlord is which is some of the most complex stuff in the 20th century because there's so many infiltrators, there's so many people who switch sides, so many different coalitions. Um, the narrative you see often in modern China is that the KMT was the government of the rest of China prior to 1945, but there was actually warlords. I think Hearts of Iron 2 actually got banned in China because it showed China split up into multiple warlord states. But my point is, it's extremely complex, and there's a lot of historical revisionism between all different sides. So the Civil War carried on until 1949, when the Nationalists, Republicans, KMT, whatever you want to call them, decisively lost, and they fled to Taiwan with the remainder of their army and political elites. They succeeded in fortifying Taiwan. Mainland China really did not have any sort of air force or navy large enough to take Taiwan. Also, there was a official, semi-official alliance that continued between America and the Republic of China, where there was more or less a security guarantee that if mainland China ever tried to conquer Taiwan, the US would intervene. Now, mainland China had all kinds of its own problems. You had the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, constant purges, tensions with the Soviets along the border. Taiwan was always kind of a thing, but it wasn't really, from my understanding, until the Soviet Union collapsed and Mao was removed and the economy started to grow, that the idea of reunification was really a major priority. The KMT, after they fled to Taiwan, there was this thing called Project National Glory, which was this meme that they were going to reinvade the mainland. And I believe to this day, Taiwan still claims to be the legitimate government of all of China, as the Republic of China did, theoretically at least, control the vast majority of what had once been the Qing Empire. You also had the issue where Taiwan was, I forget if it was to the 60s or 70s, was recognized as the official government of China and had its permanent seat on the UN Security Council until it was expelled from the UN because the PRC would not allow both states to be members of the UN. So Taiwan is not recognized formally, but in practice it is by the United States. And to a certain extent, the security agreement remains in one form or another, where there is at least an unofficial understanding that if China is going to attack Taiwan, the US will get involved. And although China has nuclear weapons now and all kinds of strategic weapons, I maintain the US still has by far the most powerful fleet on Earth, and it would be very difficult for China to invade if the US got involved. Even if they were going to invade without the US getting involved, they could do decapitation strikes against the Taiwanese government. But Taiwan has historically had a pretty strong military. It's a very wealthy country, so they can afford good quality equipment. And doing amphibious and air assaults is very difficult and costly. So, while mainland China could probably eventually win a war, it would be very difficult. It might not be something they could necessarily do overnight, but this is an extremely widely debated issue what the actual military situation would be. I think it's safe to say that just given the basic geography and the difficulties of launching amphibious assaults against a relatively strong opponent, it would be a challenge. It's not going to be as easy as it would have been if mainland China had tried to seize Hong Kong by force or something like that. And so in the modern era, you have two major factions on Taiwan. I believe it's called the Democratic People's Party, which believes that Taiwan is an independent nation. They gradually want to change the name of the country from Republic of China to Taiwan or Republic of Taiwan. And they just kind of want to go their own way, acknowledge the Civil War is over, give up the claim to mainland China, and formally declare independence. The KMT, on the other hand, believes in one China, They still see themselves as being the legitimate government of all China. And they do have a hope that one day reunification will take place under certain circumstances. And this is kind of how you get into the bizarre, like, post colonial politics of China. Like, when you look at Hong Kong, for instance, and you see, okay, who are the people who are pro business, who are socially conservative, um, that sort of thing, they actually tend to be pro Beijing. Whereas the people who are more liberal or left wing in a Western sense tend to be anti Beijing. So you have the conservatives and nationalists who are pro communist, and you have the liberals and socialists who are anti communist. It's really weird. You also have a similar situation on Taiwan, where the more, from our perspective, left wing party is anti communist China, and the more conservative nationalist party is more pro communist China. Although pro might be a stretch, but the idea is that eventually there will be some sort of reunification, that Taiwan is part of China, even if the current government is not seen as legitimate. And so we're faced with this kind of situation that doesn't really seem to have an obvious answer. There can't really be reunification at the moment in a way that's palatable to both parties. Taiwan has this, at least theoretical, security guarantee from the US, which China doesn't necessarily want to test out. And so we're just kind of in purgatory. We're kind of just sitting there waiting for something to happen on one side or another. If there's going to be regime change, if China's going to finally get fed up. And this is kind of the ongoing issue with America losing in Afghanistan, or if they lose the Russo-Ukraine war, is China will see this as weakness and take the opportunity to attack Taiwan. This is also an issue we're seeing with the whole arms to Ukraine scenario, where they can't give certain advanced weapons because they need them in the event that they go to war with China. So before we go forward, let's maybe take a major step back. So once again, in political science, you have this thing called an essentially contested concept, which is the idea that certain things just cannot be definitively and finally defined. Things like democracy, things like freedom, things like authoritarianism, even concepts such as pragmatism. You can have a collection of similar definitions and similar ideas, but not necessarily is there like a hard and fast way to say liberalism is exactly this, socialism is exactly this, conservatism is exactly this, democracy is exactly this. And it's very much like that when you get to concepts like state legitimacy and what counts as an independent country and what isn't. How long do two states have to be separated in order for them to become completely divergent societies? Like, when did Charlemagne's empire formally become France and formally become Germany? When did the Eastern and Western Roman Empire inevitably split? Was it when they administratively split? Was it after Theodosius died? Was it after Justinian, who was the last native Latin speaking Eastern emperor, died? Was it after Heraclius died? None of these things are particularly clear. The best you can do is to try to look at different cases in their totality and maybe even just try to compare them relative to each other. In this case, a lot of people are saying, well, if Ukraine is not a country, then Taiwan is not a country. Self determination is once again a concept that sounds good on paper, but something a lot of people, especially those who are pro nationalist, forget is most forms of nationalism are mutually exclusive for one another. The Transylvania question is something that Romanian and Hungarian nationalists will just disagree upon. Russian and Romanian nationalists will disagree on the status of Moldova. And there's no easy way to resolve these things because the nationalist claims are mutually exclusive. So my point is, when we're looking at the Ukraine or we're looking at Taiwan, there's not a definitive way to say this is a country, this is not a country, this has rights, this doesn't have rights. But let's just do the best job we can. So Taiwan has been independent of mainland China for quite a while now. In an administrative, political, and military sense, if we go back to 1949 when they retreated, it's been over 70 years at this point that mainland China has not had any direct control over Taiwan. So that's quite a long period of time. In the case of East versus West Germany, there was trouble with the two reuniting, and that had not gone on nearly as long. That only went on to 1990, which is 30 years shorter than the split between these two countries. Um, there's also a question when we talk about North and South Korea if the cultures and political systems have just diverged too much and reunification is no longer possible or desirable for either side, just because they're too different, there's too much asymmetry, the cultures diverge too much. And there's not exactly a time period where this definitively happens that they're different. It depends on like how much media is shared, how much interaction there continues to be. Like a lot of the Flemish still want to join Holland, even though Belgium's been independent for well over 100 years at this point in time. But there's a lot more, I would imagine, cross border contact between the two of them than between North and South Korea, where you have a giant minefield separating both of them. Also, when we get into kind of like the questions of Ukraine, Ukraine's only been independent for about 30 years. And a lot of people would argue that the borders are arbitrary because they were based on Soviet administrative divisions, which didn't correspond exactly to ethnic makeup. Also, did Ukraine really exist as an independent country prior to being absorbed by Russia? Or was it subject to the Crimean Khanate or the Ottoman Empire or Khazaria or pick your steppe people who occupied the particular area? I believe the last time you had a state that could be really referred to as Ukrainian, other than during the Russian Civil War, might even be the Kievan Rus, going way, way back in time. My point is that there's been a decent amount of time the two have been separated. And that's kind of part of it. If it's only been a couple years and it hasn't been stable, then you can maybe make a different argument on the two. The next question is one of legitimacy. Which is the legitimate government of China? And this is very, very difficult. Part of the reason that Russia invaded Ukraine was the idea that Zelensky's government was illegitimate because the ostensibly democratically elected government of Yushchenko, or however you pronounce his name, was overthrown during the Euromaidan uprising. And it was a puppet government that was imposed by the EU and America. And so that was not the legitimate government of Ukraine. The legitimate government of Ukraine was pro Russian and not pro EU. In this case, it's very complicated. So the KMT, there's a couple precursors to it prior to the Chinese Revolution, such as the Revived China Society in the 19th century. Chinese republicanism grew out of Chinese nationalism in a belief that the country had to modernize rapidly, industrialize, and adopt Western ideas in order to compete with the West. You had the Century of Humiliation, where China repeatedly just got beaten during the Opium Wars, during the Boxer Rebellion, and there was rampant corruption and incompetence. And they looked with jealousy at Japan, who had succeeded in industrializing and gaining great power status after beating Japan in the after beating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. So they wanted to overthrow the Qing. Also, the ethnic nationalism was becoming a thing, and the KMT was very much a Han Chinese nationalist movement, and they wanted to throw out the Qing and restore Han rule. I think during the early KMT rule of the country, they tried to denigrate the Qing dynasty in favor of the Ming dynasty, as it was a Han dynasty. So they wanted progressivism, they wanted revolution, and all that sort of thing. And the KMT, in one form or another, came to power after the Chinese Revolution. And you had all kinds of different eras. Under Chiang Kai shek, it was more conservative, and some people would call it para-fascist. Under Sun Yat-sen, it was a little more liberal. It really depends on the particular era, who's in power. It was more socialist at points in time. If you play Kaiserreich, and I know it's alternate history, but there's so many different KMT factions, ranging from like National Bolshevik to just moderate liberal to conservative to national populist. It's just all over the board. And throughout its time as the internationally recognized government of China, stuff like that happened. The communists were initially told by the Soviet Union to infiltrate the KMT, and Mao was actually an upcoming member within it. Sorry, side note, I had always thought that like Kuomintang stood for something, like in particular, like because they call them the nationalist Chinese, and I thought that was just a short form, kind of like how they call it nationalist Spain when that wasn't really the name of the involved groups. But I think Kuomintang literally just translates into Chinese Nationalist Party directly. There isn't, it's not like a short form for something else. That's just literally what the name of it is. Just interesting aside. So then, once the Soviet Union told the communists to leave, we had like a lengthy war between the two. The KMT was winning the civil war, I think you could argue, until the Japanese showed up. The communists, in one of history's great 4D chess moves, largely stayed out of the way, wherein the KMT just got completely blown up multiple times by the Japanese. They had their entire field army destroyed like 3 or 4 times and was left as a hulk of it. Sorry, as just a husk of its former self at the end of the war, and it was defeated and driven off the continent. And so the question is, which is the legitimate government? Is the KMT still the legitimate government? It's not technically a one-party state anymore like it used to be, but Taiwan is the direct political and legal successor to the Republic of China, which used to control most of mainland China and be the internationally recognized government. Communist China, on the other hand, is for all intents and purposes the legitimate government of China. That's just kind of the reality. We can talk about legality, we can talk about politics, we can talk about historical precedent and all this kind of thing. But at the end of the day, they control mainland China, they administer mainland China, they protect mainland China, and they are internationally recognized as the official government of mainland China. So, by all normal circumstances, they are the legitimate government at this point in time. And I think they more or less were after they decisively drove the KMT off the continent and established total control. Kind of like how, regardless of how you feel about it, the Soviet Union became the legitimate government of the former Russian Empire after the whites were decisively defeated and the Soviets were able to establish power over the rest of the country. But the issue is, it's not like the KMT is illegitimate. It's not like they're these weird usurpers, the way Russia kind of would portray Ukraine, that they're this like Western puppet government that came out of nowhere and was just imposed upon China. They were a Chinese movement that was, yes, inspired by Western ideas, but it was a homegrown Chinese movement that controlled most of the country. Is the fact that it lost control of the country remove any kind of legitimacy it might have had? And this is a very difficult question because you have two governments that, in my opinion, both have very decent claims of being legitimate. And then you get into the issue of, does the KMT really have a claim to mainland China? I don't think so at this point because they lost it a long time ago and they have no ability to affect power on the mainland or really do much involving it. Likewise, mainland China doesn't really have any ability to impact Taiwan directly. I mean, they have their infiltrators, they have their economic pressure, they have their diplomatic pressure, but they don't espouse any kind of direct rule. It's not even a case like Hong Kong or Macau where it's fairly autonomous, but it's definitively part of the People's Republic of China. And I don't really have an answer if one government is more legitimate to another. I think, honestly, the most rational conclusion would be that China is the PRC, or the Communist Party of China, is the legitimate government of mainland China, and the Republic of China is the legitimate government of Taiwan. And I get that the KMT is not always in power, but the Republic of China and the KMT were synonymous prior to the introduction of multi party elections after Chiang Kai shek's son died. There's also the issue of territorial integrity. Ukraine is kind of a mess as it's this like big open plain in between a number of large countries. It's a state that's in between like the European Union and Russia. It doesn't have defensible borders. Um, it has large portions of the population who do not want to be part of Ukraine, who would either become part of Poland or secede entirely or become part of Russia. You have the Crimean Tatars. I think like Crimea would have. You can say the election was fair or not, but I think Crimea would have voted to join the Soviet Union. Sorry, the Russian Federation. Freudian slip there. If they had been given the chance to, and some polls were suggesting that they preferred the Eurasian Union and hence Russia over Europe. You don't have that issue with Taiwan. Taiwan is a coherent geographical unit. It is an island that controls all of the island, that has natural borders, that has territorial integrity, and is capable of defending itself against an opposing enemy. You can also argue there's a substantial difference in terms of. I'm not sure how different the culture is at the moment, but there is a big difference in terms of government. Taiwan is a multi party democracy. China is a one party state that has fake opposition parties, which is an interesting thing. A side note, China in a lot of communist countries will have a big front of parties where they'll have like the main party and then they'll have fake opposition or fake coalition partners. So China has like a whole bunch of them, ironically enough, including the left wing of the KMT, who they will pretend are like, so they'll pretend they have political pluralism. But Taiwan does actually have political pluralism. It is a democracy, it is a liberal state, whereas China is, however you want to define modern China, communist, technocratic, despotic. You can take your pick. China has a weird hybrid form of government that we've addressed elsewhere. So I do think there is a political dimension. I think the longer time goes on, the more the two are diverging and the more that there's a case that they are just kind of separate. But like I said, they're in limbo where if they decisively declare independence, China might just say, look, we can't permit this to happen. We're going to fight for Taiwan, even if we have to go to war with the US and it gets into a shooting war. Let's also maybe talk a bit about the international community, in particular the US, because I think there's a tendency to view the US meddling in Taiwan as being the same as meddling in Ukraine. So I'm actually going to disagree with this. Like I said, I think some of this is just due to people who hate the US and want to side with anyone who's against them. But the US's alliance with China goes back to the 1940s. It goes back to World War II. And they've been consistently allied in one form or another. It's not like it's just something that happened after a revolution in 2014. They have actively been member allies for a long time. There has always been this unofficial or official agreement that Taiwan would be defended by the US in the event of a mainland invasion. And you can call me naive on this point, but I do think there is something to be said in honoring your historical agreements and honoring your alliances, even if you don't think it's necessarily a good idea or pragmatic or practical. I do have to give some credit. If people want to say that America should back Taiwan because that's the understanding and that's the agreement that America's formally and informally made, I think that's a legitimate argument. Because as I've said, your word is all you have when it comes to international politics. There's also the question of, is it in America's interest to back Taiwan? Because that was the big complaint. Like the message some people had towards the Iraq war was the worst problem of the war wasn't that they invaded Iraq. It was that Iraq we didn't get any oil out of it. So, like the invasion of Iraq was not in America's national interest, and a lot of the other conflicts America gets involved in is not in its national interest. Now, is it different here? Does America have a national interest in Taiwan? I would argue they do, because they do want some sort of a counterbalance. They don't want Southeast Asia to become a Chinese lake. They don't want Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and Japan, and all these other countries to fall under not Chinese control, but fall into the Chinese orbit. They want there to be some sort of loose coalition of anti Chinese countries to counterbalance it. America has huge economic interests in this part of the world, and a variety of political commitments to its allies, to Korea, to the Philippines, to Australia, to Japan. And a loss of this area to China would be a major blow economically and politically. I don't agree with a lot of people that you should have 100% isolationism. I think you have to pick your friends properly, but Japan and Korea have proven to be faithful friends to the United States. They've proven to be excellent trading partners. And I do think that America, other than like, as opposed to like Israel or Saudi Arabia or some of the other countries, I do think there's an argument to be made to defend Japan and South Korea and to a certain extent Taiwan, and that it is in America's interest to keep a neutral armed Taiwan to counterbalance Chinese military power within the Pacific. Buffer states, whether you like them or not, are an accepted part of international politics. Mongolia was neither annexed by China nor Russia. My understanding is Mongolia offered to join the Soviet Union, but the Soviets didn't want them to join because it gave them this just massive stretch of territory they didn't really have to defend, and they could focus their troops elsewhere. And it was just too useful as a buffer state for either side to really grab up. And I think to an extent, Taiwan can be seen as a useful buffer state to the United States, at least. And it would also just be a huge prestige loss if Taiwan was to be taken over by mainland China after having been backed by the U.S. for a very long time. I don't think like Ukraine being lost would be that big a prestige loss, at least prior to the intervention where they started giving all the weapons to Ukraine and stuff, as I think it could be very easily spun as Russia is just dealing with internal issues or it's their sphere of influence, whereas I think the historical precedent with Taiwan is quite different. So that's my thoughts on the matter. I do think Taiwan is an independent country. I don't really see any argument that it's not, aside from the fact that it's a Chinese speaking, Chinese cultural, Chinese ethnic place. But I do think it's been independent long enough. It has territorial integrity, and its political system is different enough that you could make a strong case that it is its own country. Likewise, I think you could make a case that America should at least make some effort to defend it. I do think it's more in its national interest, both politically and economically, than Ukraine was, or Syria was, or Iraq was, or a lot of the other wars that America's gotten themselves involved in over the last couple decades. So, those are my thoughts on the matter.